My wife called me from her mother's funeral to tell me she wanted a divorce. Not that evening when she got home, not the following week when the grief had settled enough to have a real conversation. From the funeral. She stepped outside the church, called my number, and told me that her mother's death had made her realize she had been living the wrong life, that she deserved more, that she had already spoken to an attorney. What she didn't know was that her mother's estate had a second will, and that the executor of that will was me. My name is Thomas Reeves. I'm 44 years old. I run a civil engineering firm that I built from a 2-person operation in a rented office into a company with 31 employees and contracts across 4 states. I grew up in rural Kentucky, the son of a man who fixed other people's equipment for 40 years and died with more dignity than most people who made 10 times his income. He taught me one thing above everything else, that what you build with your hands and your time belongs to you in a way that nothing handed to you ever quite does. I married Victoria in 2009. She was a landscape architect, talented, creative, with a particular vision of someone who could look at an empty piece of land and see exactly what it wanted to become. For the first 7 years, we built things together. The business, a house, a life that felt, from the inside, like something real and lasting. Then her mother Margaret got sick, and everything that followed changed the shape of what we were to each other. Margaret Holloway had been sick for 3 years before she died. Ovarian cancer, slow and then fast, the way that particular disease tends to move. She was a complicated woman, sharp, demanding, with opinions about everything including my income, my background, and whether her daughter had made the right choice. She had never fully accepted me. I'd never fully stopped trying. Somewhere in those 3 years of illness, as Victoria spent more and more time at her mother's house managing her care and her affairs, something shifted between us. Victoria came home less. When she was home, she was somewhere else. I told myself it was grief in advance, the particular exhaustion of watching a parent decline. I kept working. I kept the house running. I kept showing up. What I didn't know was that Victoria had met someone during those 3 years. His name was Patrick. He was a contractor her mother had hired to renovate the kitchen of her house 2 years before she died. 40 years old, recently divorced, the kind of man who was always available because he had arranged his life to have no competing obligations. I found out the way you find out about these things. Not all at once, not with a confrontation, but in pieces that accumulated until the picture was impossible to misread. A name mentioned once, and then never again. A weekend she spent at her mother's house when Margaret was well enough not to need her. The particular way Victoria stopped asking about the business, not gradually, the way interest fades, but suddenly, like a door closing. I said nothing. I had learned from watching my father that the time between knowing something and acting on it is where most people make their worst decisions. He used to say, a man who reacts before he understands what he's reacting to loses twice, once to the situation and once to himself. I kept working. I kept the house running. I kept my counsel. I waited. Margaret Holloway died on a Wednesday morning in April. Victoria flew down that afternoon. I followed 2 days later for the funeral, which was a small service at the Episcopal church Margaret had attended for 40 years. 30 people, maybe 40. Old friends, neighbors, the contractor, Patrick, standing in the 3rd row with his hands folded and his eyes on Victoria in a way that confirmed everything I already knew. Victoria stepped outside during the reception afterward. I watched her take out her phone. I watched her walk to the far end of the parking lot. I gave her 10 minutes. Then my phone rang. She told me what she had decided, that her mother's death had clarified things, that she had been unhappy and she had found someone who made her feel the way she deserved to feel, and she was sorry, but she wasn't going back, that her attorney would be in touch the following week. I stood in the parking lot of an Episcopal church in April with the sound of the reception behind me, and I said, "Okay, Victoria, we'll talk when you get home." I hung up and went back inside. What Victoria did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Margaret Holloway had revised her will 14 months before she died. The original will had left everything equally between Victoria and her brother Daniel, who lived in Portland and had visited his mother twice in 3 years. The revised will was different. Margaret had called me on a Tuesday afternoon 14 months before her death. I was at the office. She said she needed to talk to me about something and asked if I could come by that evening. I went. We sat at her kitchen table, the same kitchen Patrick had renovated, which I noted and said nothing about, and she told me what she had decided. She said she had watched me show up for 3 years while her son visited twice, and her daughter had started making choices Margaret didn't approve of and wouldn't name directly, but made clear she was aware of. She said she had been wrong about me when Victoria and I first married, and she wanted to correct that while she still could. She said she was leaving me 30% of her estate directly, including the farmhouse and the 12 acres it sat on, and she was naming me as executor of the entire estate. I told her she didn't have to do that. She told me she was aware of what she had to do, and this was what she had decided. She was not a woman who revised her positions lightly or welcomed debate about them once they were fixed. Her attorney was a careful man named Gerald Marsh, who had handled her affairs for 18 years. He had prepared the revised documents. Everything was in order. I left that evening and I did not tell Victoria, not because I was planning anything, because Margaret had asked me not to until the time was right. She said, "You'll know when." I trusted her judgment on that. She had not been wrong about much. The estate cleared probate 6 weeks after the funeral. Gerald called me on a Thursday morning to confirm. The farmhouse and 12 acres in Henderson County were valued by independent appraisal at $1.4 million. Margaret's investment accounts, which Victoria had believed were modest, were not modest. The total estate came to $2.9 million. My 30% was $870,000, held separately and entirely outside any marital asset we had established together. Victoria's attorney sent the divorce filing the same week Gerald called. My attorney was a woman named Sandra Okafor, recommended by my accountant, who had described her as someone who read financial documents the way other people read novels, closely and with complete retention. She reviewed Victoria's filing carefully. She reviewed the estate documentation carefully. She made several notes. Then she asked me one question. "Does your wife know about the will revision?" "No," I said. "She does not." Sandra nodded in the way that people nod when something confirms what they already suspected. We filed our financial disclosure the following week. It included, properly documented and supported by Gerald's certification, my inheritance from Margaret Holloway's revised estate, $870,000, predating the divorce filing, entirely separate property under the applicable statute. I was told that Victoria's attorney requested a recess of 30 minutes when he reviewed the disclosure. I was told that Victoria had to sit down. She called me that evening. Her voice had the quality of someone who has just recalculated something and doesn't like the new number. "Thomas," she said, "we need to talk about my mother's will." "I think our attorneys are handling everything," I said. "Have a good night, Victoria." I ended the call. The divorce took 10 months. Sandra was thorough, and Victoria's attorney eventually ran out of viable approaches. The final settlement was arrived at through mediation, which Sandra had advised was likely to produce a cleaner outcome than trial. She was right. The farmhouse I kept. It sat on 12 acres of good land in Henderson County, and Margaret had loved it with the particular attachment of someone who had built something over decades and knew its value better than any appraiser. I was not going to sell it. Victoria kept the house we had shared for 11 years, which was what she had wanted and which suited me fine. I did not need to live in rooms that held the particular silence of a marriage that had ended badly. I drove down to Henderson County 3 weeks after the settlement finalized, stayed in the farmhouse for a long weekend, walked the 12 acres on a Saturday morning in the kind of early summer that makes rural Kentucky look like something from a painting. The light through the old hardwoods, the fields still wet from rain the night before, the particular quiet of land that has been cared for over a long time. I thought about Margaret walking these same acres in her last healthy years, about the kitchen table where she had told me what she had decided, about the fact that she had seen something in me that she had initially refused to see and had corrected that refusal while she still had time. My father would have liked this land. He understood it the way he understood engines, not theoretically, but from the hands up. He would have walked it slowly and noticed things I didn't notice and said very little about what he saw. That was his way. I have a property manager handling the farmhouse now. It generates enough rental income to cover its own costs with something left over. I get down there 3 or 4 times a year, more in the summer. The business is doing well. We won a significant infrastructure contract in September that will keep 31 people employed through the next 2 years. I hired a project manager in November, a young engineer named Torres, sharp and slightly overconfident in the way that good engineers sometimes are early in their careers, which I find more useful than the alternative. Someone asked me recently whether I was angry at Victoria, at the phone call from the parking lot, at the 3 years, at all of it. I thought about Margaret at her kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, telling me she had been wrong and wanted to correct it. I thought about my father fixing other people's equipment for 40 years and dying with more dignity than people who made 10 times his income. No, I said. She just didn't know who she was dealing with. Some people find that out early. Some people find that out later. Margaret always knew.